The coronavirus pandemic is causing havoc around the globe, sending cities and nations into lockdown and continuing to spread. The Philippines was the first Southeast Asian nation to adopt the lockdown measures, and on Tuesday, its Congress approved the bill declaring a national emergency. So how is the coronavirus affecting the Philippines, and how is China assisting the country in their battle against it? In the first part of the program, I'll be joined by Huang Xilian, Chinese ambassador to the Philippines, to talk about the situation. Meanwhile, the G7 nations have pledged to do whatever is necessary to fight the virus and restore economic growth. What actions are needed in response to a worldwide pandemic, and how likely is a global recession? To find out in the second half of our program, I'll be talking to Taguchi Okubu, director of the Economist Corporate Network for North Asia, and Professor Jeffrey Towson from Peking University. That's our topic. This is a dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Welcome to our discussion here, Mr. Ambassador. How serious is the current COVID-19 situation in the Philippines?
Hello, good afternoon, Yang Rui. Yes, the coronavirus in Philippines is spreading very fast in past few days. I think yesterday the confirmed cases has reached 562. And what is more important is that the mortality rate has been very high, at about 7%, much higher than that of the global average of 3%. That caused panic among the people here. And what should be mentioned is that, in the past months, the testing process has been slow. Every day, only a few dozens of tests of coronavirus, and so far, only more than 1,000 tests have been conducted. That means out of the more than 1,000 tests, there are already, that's more than 500 confirmed cases. So until now, only 1 out of 100,000 people of the population in the Philippines has been tested. So that shows that there might be a huge number of confirmed cases, people infected, compared with the factual number. And that at the moment, the situation is very severe and also very challenging. And a lot of, that hospitals have, run out of the empty beds, and quite a lot of the doctors are being infected. And it's very unfortunate that 3 doctors have passed away due to being infected. And that most of the confirmed cases have happened in the island of Luzon. The Luzon island has a population of more than 50 million people. So I think there is a great danger for the coronavirus to spread among the population in this island. That caused a lot of, attention.
What
So
impact
you,
is the coronavirus pandemic having on the Filipino economy?
Yes, I think it's having a great impact on the economy. And that the economy of the Philippines is quite dependent on foreign trade and service sector. So because as the main trading partners of the Philippines, including China, the United States, South Korea, have been affected seriously by the coronavirus, and that caused also a problem for the Philippines. And for service sector, due to the coronavirus, the number of tourists have plummeted drastically, and if the epidemic lasts until June, so it's estimated that the tourist number will reduce by 1.6 million. That will also cause a great loss for the economy of the Philippines. And of course, the stock market has been also affected very seriously. In the past 2 weeks, the stock market has been volatile, and within 1 week time, the kind of the circuits breakers were triggered for 3 times. That's very rare in the history of the stock markets of the Philippines. And another important factor is that Philippines has a strong force of overseas workers. It has altogether more than 10 million overseas workers, and that has become the main source of income for this country. But because of the coronavirus, a lot of the foreign workers are not able to go to their working place, and quite a lot of them, lost their job. So that's also will have, very profound impact on the economy. And the government of the Philippines is working very hard to, come up with some measures to deal with the situation.
Mr. Ambassador, Mr. Ambassador, China went through a
this.
lot, and we sure have a lot to provide the Filipino government with our experiences and even bitter lessons. So next, would you brief us on collaboration and the cooperation between China and the Philippines in fighting our common enemy, the pandemic?
Okay. I think that before we are helping them, before that, they have helped us a lot in the past few months when China was in a very difficult time battling the epidemic. The Philippine government provided aid to China, although they were still also facing difficulties. And the president of the Philippines, Mr. Duterte, have been commending the Chinese efforts in battling this epidemic, and it's has spoken very high of China's efforts in fighting the epidemic. And the people from all walks of life of the Philippines have been donating a lot of the money and also medical reliefs to China. In the past few months, I think millions of PPE, that's personal protective equipment, have been donated to China. And now, Philippines is facing difficulties. I think it's time for China to help them. And the Chinese government has attached great importance to the relationship with the Philippines. And there is a tradition between our 2 countries to help each other in difficult times. So in the past 2 weeks, I think we have done a lot. My embassy has come up first to donate 2,000 test kits to the Philippine government, and followed by a huge amount of the donation by the government of China to the government of the Philippines. That's last week. The government of China donated 100,000 test kits and other PPEs to the Philippines. I think that helped a lot for the Philippine government to increase the test of the coronavirus. And also there are a lot of firms, companies, and individuals from China who are donating to the government and people of the Philippines. And we believe in this trying time that governments and peoples of the 2 countries will continue to help each other and go through difficult times hand in hand. Back to you.
What kind of assistance has your embassy provided to the overseas Chinese in the Philippines during this pandemic period?
Okay. There are quite a lot of Chinese citizens in this country, including students, teachers, and Chinese workers. And of course, there are a big number of overseas Chinese, that's Filipino Chinese in this country. So we, as embassy here in the Philippines, we have worked very hard to help the Chinese citizens to deal with the epidemic. We have issued quite a few advisories. We reminded them of the situation, the pandemic situation, and also to brief them about the measures taken by the Philippine government in dealing with the epidemic. And we also have, issued some platforms on which that they might consult doctors if they have any symptoms. And of course, we also have organized some, Filipino-Chinese organizations here who could help the students and teachers who are still staying in this country. And this week, we also have sent quite some, face masks to students and teachers who are still staying in this country. And we work with them in a very close way to let them know we will be together with them and do not need to panic, and we will go through this difficult time together.
And what do you think of the leadership of President Duterte? Because in times of crisis, a country badly needs a wartime leader, and usually it's the case that the president, the elected politicians would be in the forefront of fighting an enemy, and thus the approval rating would rise very quickly. Is that also the case with President Duterte?
Yes, I think that President Duterte has played a very strong leadership role in the process of combating the epidemic. I think that the Philippines is the first one in Asia to impose that kind of lockdown as practiced by China in the past few weeks. And at the beginning, the government of Philippines imposed, they call it that community quarantine, and then followed by the second version of enhanced quarantine, second version of the enhanced community quarantine. So now shops are closed down and the factories are also shut down, and the law enforcement agencies are patrolling in the streets. And I think this is a very rigorous measures taken by the Philippine government. Although there are some criticisms about the draconian measures, but most of the people, we believe that have a confidence in the government of the Philippines in dealing with the epidemic. And I think the situation is in general calm, and people are cooperating with the government to deal with these difficult times.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador. And that's Ambassador Huang Xilian, the Chinese ambassador to the Philippines, sharing with us his perspectives on the campaign against the coronavirus pandemic in the Philippines. We'll be back in a short while, and I'll be talking to economists about the world situation economically. Stay with us, please. Welcome back. In the second half, we are very happy to be joined here by Mr. Taguchi Okubo, who is standing by in our studio in Tokyo, and Mr. Jeffrey Towson, a professor from Peking University. We're addressing issues of the global economy under the impact of the latest pandemic. Welcome to our discussion here. First of all, G7 countries agreed to do whatever is necessary to combat the coronavirus from the health perspective as well as its economic effects. So question is, how substantial is the pledge? And in your view, gentlemen, what are the necessary actions that should be done to address the crisis? First of all, Jeffrey.
Well, I mean, I think we're seeing two problems emerging. One is the health problem and one is the economic problem. And the G7 probably can't do much about the economic situation. That's country by country. But definitely on the health side, there's things that can be done, sharing of information, getting the data out from hospitals, from public health systems, just putting all that information out there so that all the scientists, all the public health workers everywhere can start to look at it and take it apart. So definitely the G7 can do things like that. There can also be some sort of critical resource coordination, ventilators, masks, hazmat suits, getting those where they need to go. Some hospitals are going to have bigger problems than others. There's a bit of a scarcity on a lot of this, so a lot of that sort of management can happen right now. So I think more on the public health side and the overall response, you can see some moves being made. On the economy side, it looks like a recession and maybe worse.
Mr. Albuto, is it true that the world economy will grind to a halt and there will be a very serious recession?
Yes, obviously, now that many parts of Europe as well as the U.S. are in a shutdown, so there's a severely less economic activity in this area. So in Asia, things are actually starting to get better, especially in China, and I would say Hong Kong, Taiwan as well. But things are still in a very precarious condition. So the threat of a global recession is definitely there. And many people think it's already imminent, but I still think with aggressive monetary and fiscal easing, it is still not too late for the world to to avoid great recession similar to Lehman shock. I think aggressive policy reaction is the key.
Mr. Okubo, everyone is holding their breath about why the postponement of the 2020 Tokyo Olympic Games. Now, it seems an agreement has been reached upon between Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and the head of the IOC. What will be the consequences for the Japanese economy?
Well, I'm personally not so worried about any negative repercussion from postponing the Olympic. I think even if Japan insisted to hold Olympic this year, nobody would come for Japan to watch sports. So, I think it would have been just a very silent Olympic with very little economic benefits. So I think postponing Olympic to next year, I think this was actually a best outcome. And so when we want to discuss negative impact, I think it's all basically coming from COVID-19. So it's the decision to postpone the Olympic to next year is actually relatively irrelevant.
Professor Towson, in addition to previous disagreements between the United States and Europe on issues of defense spending, trade, and climate change, now new fractures are emerging over the U.S. unilaterally imposed travel ban and its reported efforts in seeking an exclusive vaccine deal. To what extent do you believe the G7 can rally these two large economies in fighting the coronavirus pandemic? And will the G7's multilateral commitments be compromised by Trump's America First policy?
Right. One of the things I really like about the G7 is you can get everyone around the table. It's not that many people at the end of the day. So it's actually a pretty functional group, especially if they're focused, which is usually not the case. Everybody's focused right now. When the G7 meets, everybody knows what to talk about. Everyone has a problem. Everyone's at the table. In terms of multilateral organizations, that's actually pretty effective as a situation. So I think this is one of these cases where hopefully the greater good is going to overwhelm politics and personal feelings about people. People are pretty focused right now. So I'm hoping, Donald Trump, the UK, Germany, France, Italy, Japan, the EU reps, that they can actually have a productive conversation, which is, these things are generally not that productive. Like, people can't tell you what happened at the G7 last year.
Pretty soon, Saudi Arabia will host the G20 summit meeting. However, many may still be wondering why, during the absence of Russia, China fails to be invited because we are the second largest economy. Is it true that G7 has been viewed as an arc of freedom and prosperity? It's pretty clubby. It only accepts members that share the same values. Or do you think it should not be so ideologically motivated? China should have been invited, at least as an observer, to join the discussion about issues of common concern, particularly at this defining moment of the pandemic. Jeffrey?
Yeah, I think everyone kind of understands the G7 in terms of what it is, the values, the economic sort of heft of the groups involved. But then we look at a country like China, which is incredibly important, but also operates with a very, very different system. And, how do you reconcile, how do you get groups that really do have different political economic systems to work together? Should they all be in one group? Should you have two? Should you have, observer status? And that should be both directions. It might make sense for the U.S. to be an observer in a, sort of a G7 type group with China as the main party. And I think that's something that everyone's kind of grappling with right now. Is it values? Is it just an Asia question?
Well, probably it's an issue about how to
Asia.
reconstruct the world economic order and how to streamline the world financial order. You may raise a lot of issues concerning economic reconfiguration in this process of globalization when the United States decides to pull out of so many multilateral commitments or frameworks. Let me go back to Mr. Okubo. You don't think there will be a lot of you won't make a big deal out of this current postponement of postponement of the Olympic Games. But let me ask you, some Western media argue that the pandemic has amplified Trump's instincts to go it alone and exposed just how unprepared the United States is to lead the global response. Do you agree? And how well was Prime Minister Shinzo Abe prepared in coping with the unpredictability of President Trump? What's your take on the U.S. global leadership?
Right. So I think there's a long-term and short-term impact. I think in the short term, I think President Trump definitely lost credibility within the U.S. So a lot of his policy decisions must be coming into questions. And obviously, U.S. is in a situation where they need a lot of they need help when it comes to information from China, information from Europe. I think U.S. policymakers must be feeling there's additional need for more policy coordination in a global sense. However, that's a short term. In the longer term, I think there's still some tendency for U.S. to isolate itself, and this COVID-19 pandemic, this might actually encourage U.S. companies, U.S. policymakers to feel that they should actually be more self-sufficient. They should reduce their reliance outside U.S. So in the longer term, I do believe that this COVID-19 actually may encourage further isolation of U.S. from the rest of the world.
Let me go back to Jeffrey. Latest news shows that President Trump has reached an agreement, a very important landmark agreement with the senators in formulating a stimulus package. Now, what kind of a stimulus package is likely to have been adopted by lawmakers and the president? I was told that American multinationals would have to be pulling out of their individual host countries and go back to the United States. But what about the labor costs? What about the many other issues related to the global ecosystem concerning the global supply chain? Is it an easy job to just order the American companies to just come back?
Right. I mean, in the U.S., there's this discussion happening right now of everybody knows companies are going to need support because, they've been told to shut down. It's not like they had a choice. The government said shut down, and then, how most businesses can't last with zero revenue coming in very long without doing mass layoffs, which you don't want mass unemployment either. So there's this discussion going on in the Senate of, we're going to get money to these companies in some form, and then there's some partisan divide on how is that going to happen. Are banks going to do it by interest-free loans, or is the government going to actively say, here's what you must do in order to get money, and we're going to pick and choose? So you see a partisan divide happening right now in the U.S., and that'll sort itself out fairly quickly. Is this going to extend outside the U.S. borders? Probably not. I think everyone's going to hunker down with the idea that, we can't shut things down for very long. I mean, it's just not possible. So everything is going to have to start up probably within weeks in some form, or, things will start to cascade. Businesses close, mass unemployment, bank defaults, real estate. I mean, this will cascade at a certain point, so it's going to have to come back to normal fairly quickly.
Yeah, with nosedive plummeting of stock shares, particularly unprecedented numbers of trade haltings. Let me ask you, Mr. Okubo, The International Monetary Fund said on Monday that the coronavirus pandemic will cause a global recession in 2020 that could be worse than the one triggered by the 2008 global financial meltdown. How concerned are you about the global recession? How effective can monetary and fiscal policies be in reviving the global economy?
So, well, there are still uncertainties. One big uncertainty is how long this COVID-19 lasts. You know, could the European countries come back from a hard shutdown anytime soon? So if it lasts for just a few weeks, maybe a month, and then followed by a recovery, say, you know, either V-shaped or U-shaped recovery in the second half of 2020, I think we may experience kind of a technical recession, but it could be a mild recession, so nothing compared to the Lehman shock. However, if this shutdown could be repeated, so, you know, shutdown, come back to the recovery, but then shutdown again, if this goes on for months, say half a year, I think this would definitely cause a much greater recession. I still feel it's going to be a milder than the Lehman shock recession, but I think depending on how long-lasting the shutdown could be in Europe and in US, this could actually accelerate to the size as big as the Lehman shock Great Recession.
Mr. Okubo, let me go back to the issue of the latest development in the D.C. Now, the U.S. senators and President Trump, they have reached an agreement on a massive economic stimulus bill to alleviate the economic impact of the coronavirus outbreak. White House official Eric Uland said early on Wednesday that, you know, trillions of dollars will be pouring into the market despite the quantitative easing. So what do you think of, you know, such options that are put on the table?
Right. So I do believe that this monetary policy reaction, fiscal policy reaction, I think this is actually coming sooner than probably expected. I think Federal Reserve was very quick to react by slashing rates. And I do believe this talk of potential tax cuts and the size of the fiscal stimulus, this is actually sizable. And that's why financial markets are rallying yesterday and today. So I think these policy reactions are still, so I think financial market is saying that they actually feel, they don't think there's imminent threat of a Lehman shock size recession. So I think these aggressive policy intervention is really helping to prevent what could be a mild recession from developing into a much greater recession.
Thank you very much. That's Mr. Okubo. Let me go back to Jeffrey Towson. The U.S. Federal Reserve announced on Monday that it would buy as many treasury bonds and mortgage-backed securities as needed to support smooth market functioning. Will the Fed's limited quantitative easing show up the U.S. economy, and what does it mean for the rest of the world?
Right. I mean, this is, you know, we're getting into monetary policy, which is a bit out of my area of expertise, but, you know, from my understanding is it's clear the economic activity is slowing down dramatically. It has to because we're all sitting at home. At what point does that tip into a liquidity crisis? At what time does that tip into a financial crisis? So, you know, just making sure the Fed is moving money in there in various forms is going to be important. But I don't know what the point is at which the economic slowdown turns into something more acute and rapidly expanding like a financial crisis.
Thank you so much for being with us. And that's Mr. Okubo, economist from the Economist Network based in Tokyo, and Professor Jeffrey Towson, who teaches at the Peking University here in Beijing. Thank you both for being with us. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.